This is the first of hopefully many A-Train University classes, and tonight's class is going to be on sizing your bets. And we're going to talk a little bit about Kelly Criterion, we're going to talk a little bit about devigging, and we're going to go through a couple examples and talk about the things that I kind of go too fast during the live streams, and any other videos that I have out there are probably not detailed enough. So the goal for these A-Train University classes is to dive deeper into a specific subject and really cover it so that A-Train Station members have a high degree of confidence in using these features or managing this aspect of their betting strategy. So we're going to start with where we start all the time when we go into A-Train Station, and that's with our account settings, specifically the bet sizing settings in our settings page. And so in bet sizing, Bankroll is literally the amount of money you have allocated to sports betting, or could be allocated to sports betting, could be sitting in a special savings account that you could then apply to whatever book needed some cash. It's the total amount that you are willing to put at risk for sports betting. And that is an amount that, depending on how big it is for you, you may want to be changing it every day, or you may want to round it, or you may want to say, you know, as long as I'm over this particular number, I'll level up. Like, that's kind of what I do in my bankroll sizing. I'm currently significantly over 27,000, but I'm not quite at 28,000, at least on my picket tracked stuff. So that's where I'll just say, I'm leaving it at 27,000 until I easily clear 28,000, then I'll ramp it up to that. So that's the key for the bankroll sizing. Now, Kelly Criterion is how we get ultimately those bet size recommendations that you see on the plays screen with all the listed plays, and on the bet details screen, where you're looking at, based on this particular odds in this market with this EV calculation, here's the bet size recommendation. Well, the Kelly Criterion is a risk of ruin calculator, or a portfolio management calculator. It's funny because the Kelly Criterion was not developed for sports betting. And a lot of people are like, well, it was probably just developed in the financial industry for portfolio management or stock trading or whatever. Nope, that's not true either. It was actually developed by this dude, John Kelly, who was a researcher at Bell Labs, and he developed this formula to analyze the long distance telephone signal to noise ratio. This is what he was doing. He was evaluating long distance lines, and he created this formula, and now we use it for sports betting. So keep that in mind when you're like, Kelly Criterion knows all, and that is our optimal bet sizing. That is not the case. That is not how that works. What it really is about having a minimum recommendation around portfolio diversification. It was originally looking at noise in a line. It's noise in your portfolio. It's what can happen given the likelihood of the event occurring. It's actually a very simple calculation if you want to look it up. It's not... It's a little too deep to try to go through on the top, off the top of our head. The math is not as important as knowing. It's actually pretty straightforward, but it's all tied to what are the likelihood of this side of the event occurring, which has an obvious application in sports betting. The problem is we don't actually know what the likelihood of winning. We estimate it. We think we have a good guess at what it is, but we don't know for sure. And so if you plug in an estimate with really good sound math, what do you have? As good of an estimate as it could possibly be, is as good as that calculation could possibly be. And that's the thing that people often fail to realize, is that they use Kelly blindly, not realizing that your estimate of the fair odds, the no vig line, the likelihood of one side or another winning, that is so much more important, because that's the piece we don't ever fully exactly know. So keep that in mind. And the reason that that's so important is that the Kelly Criterion is often used in gambling and portfolio management, like I said. However, in sports betting is extra risky because we have a much wider margin of error, because the estimates could be calculated a whole bunch of different ways. I mean, I've seen people use Bovada as their sharp book. Good luck with that, right? Maybe they're right some of the time, but if that's what you're playing Pinnacle against, you're going to have problems, because Pinnacle's better than Bovada, right? So that's the thing. You can estimate all you want, but if your estimates are bad, Your Kelly criteria ain't helping you because it's only the recommended Kelly bet for a negative EV play is nothing. That's nothing, right? So if you mistakenly bet something because you think it's EV, but it was really not EV, Kelly's not helping you there. It's only hurting you because it's overstating what your true bet should have been, which is 0, right? So keep that in mind. It is not magic. None of this is magic. All of this is math and estimates of probability and market analysis and all these things. In the context of perfect information, in the context of a truly known, like you're flipping a coin and you know exactly that it's 50%, or if you have a weighted coin and you know it's exactly 60%, you can work with that. In sports betting, we're just never entirely sure. There's always that margin of error. Kelly multiplier allows us to kind of just reduce it all off the top, right? And so the question sometimes is, well, can I ever bet more than Kelly? Sure, you can bet whatever the fuck you want, right? The fact is that Kelly's just one more tool to help gauge what you should bet. And if you have a low Kelly multiplier, so a standard Kelly multiplier in sports betting could be as much as 50%. And that is a pretty aggressive multiplier. But it's also probably way overstated considering the fact that in positive EV betting or in top-down betting, we are typically making a whole bunch of bets into markets that we are literally not even paying attention to which side we are betting. Like, we don't know. We have no opinion. We are not trying to outthink the likelihood of that event occurring. We're just trying to estimate it. And then we're looking at the money and we're like, hey, that money's better than what it should be. We're betting it, right? So at the best case, we are going to take on quite a bit of risk because we are really subject to where we're setting those no vig odds. So the Kelly multiplier that I use is extra conservative, partially because I don't like betting as much as what this bankroll could support. I've done that. I've won money. I've lost money. I have indigestion. I don't want to bet that much. And you know what? That's totally cool. You don't have to bet that much. Now, am I leaving money on the table? Yeah, I could be making more than I am. But I sleep okay at night because I at least am betting sizes that I can handle the swings with, which is a very overlooked aspect of bet sizing a lot of the time, which is your own mental health. What are you okay losing on a particular day? Are you going to be despondent if you lose more than $100? Are you going to be despondent if you lose more than $1,000? I've lost more than $3,000 in one day. I did not enjoy that. I would not want to do that again. I regularly lose in the $1,000 to $2,000 range. It's a pretty bad day, but I'm used to it enough that I can be okay with it, especially on a 100 bet day when most of my bet sizes are 100 or whatever. You run really bad one day, 30 games under 500, that's going to happen. It doesn't happen often, and I have just as many winners, if not many more winners of that same size, and I'm like, you know what? I can live with that. But that is such an important gauge that comes through experience, is understanding what you're okay with, not just from a bet size optimization standpoint, but from a mental health standpoint. And so for me, the Kelly multiplier 15%, I've dabbled with raising it. I don't really care to right now. And that's it. I have total confidence in what we're doing with the station, make them killing it. But I'm just like, you know what? I'm having fun. I'm enjoying my bet sizing and I can get through the day, even on the really bad days, and it doesn't bother me. So that's, to me, as somebody who really doesn't enjoy sweating the bets and worrying about the money in and out or whatever, and this money is set aside for sports betting that I know it's going to grow over time, I'm fine with this. But I would recommend probably for most people, especially if your bankroll's lower and you've really got a conservative bankroll size, like you have a lot of money sitting in savings you're not going to touch or whatever, and this bankroll is literally something that you would be comfortable losing. If you have a $5,000 bankroll and you're like, you know what, if I lost that bankroll, I'd have another $5,000 I could put towards it. That's not really the right bankroll amount in the first place. But the second thing is just probably start with a 25% or so as a general rule. Mine is way under that for reasons I just explained. However, when you start out, just go too low. Don't go too high. Don't err on the side of going too high ever in terms of bet sizing. Always go too low. And that's what I'd even do when I do the betting. And we'll go through a couple examples. But when I do my betting, I'm always looking for reasons to bet less. And if I decide not to bet at all, I bet zero, right? So it's really not a question. I often say, we decide, do we want to make a play or not? And if we do, how much? It's actually a simpler decision matrix than that. Do I want to bet how much? And sometimes that's zero. And that's the thing. And you could actually say sometimes it's negative because I go and bet the other side for some reason. But it's really 0 to whatever amount is the question. It's one decision. Am I betting 0 to whatever amount? There's other little decisions in there where like, do I want to look more detail at a play? Do I want to do additional research? Do I want to do this, that, or whatever? But at its core, where on that continuum from 0 to all of my bankroll do I want to make that play? So depending on which way is easier for you to think about it, I usually, once I hit a certain threshold where I'm like, it's not worth the time to go play 74 cents at Bet Rivers on a player prop, then I'm just saying no. So there, you kind of just falls off and you say, I'm just not betting it at all. But depending on how you want to think about it, that's fine. And again, I'm going to try to explain how I do it, but I'm also trying to explain how you might want to do it, because ultimately the most important thing is that you're comfortable and you have longevity in your sports betting. The second most important thing is that you solve for winning as much money as possible. So keep in mind, first most important thing is that you're comfortable and have longevity. You want to stick with this. You don't want to overbet that bankroll, because if that bankroll, the whole point of risk of ruin is like, you don't want to go broke. You don't want to go broke either from a true cash perspective or from a point where you're mentally just can't handle it. Like, I'm just done. Like, we've all had those moments, right? With alcohol, especially for a lot of us. Like, I'm never drinking again. If you're betting too much in sports betting, even when you have the edge, the normal swings of things could make it so that you end up just burning out. And so you don't want to have that either. So high level, those are the key considerations there. Now, when it comes to specific sizing of bets, I'm a big advocate for rounding your bet sizing to ideally $5, at minimum $1. I would fight and push back on anyone who's rounding to less than $1, even at very small bankrolls, because that is a shining beacon of sharpness to any of the sportsbook traders out there who are looking to limit people. Because if you're going out and betting 1263 on a bet, anybody who's working the trading desk at Bet Rivers is going to be like, that person's using an algorithm. Let's just ban them and move on to the next sucker, right? That's all they are going to do, right? So just try to have a little chill with that. Just be like, oh, around to $10 or $5. Like, that would be ideal. $5 or $10, fine, right? So just keep in mind that if you look like less of a sharp bettor, you might get a little bit more longevity, and that is more plus EV than eking out that, you know, really precise bet size on a Kelly Criterion calculation on top of an estimate that has a much wider range of error, margin of error than $1, right? So keep that in mind. Please consider rounding to the nearest dollar. Okay, that's that part of it. The devigging methodology. So we have entire videos on devigging methodologies. We're going to do an A-Train University class on devigging methodology as well, I'm sure. But the quick Cliff's Notes version of this is just use worst case unless you know better. And once you know better, you're probably going to be like, well, I'm going to use worst case now because I know better. And so that's probably the answer. And the reason is that worst case really helps you control for the higher degree of uncertainty and error that creeps into these different devigging calculations at higher numerical values or lower numerical values. So as the underdogs and favorites get bigger, the error in individual mechanisms starts to skew one way or another or what have you. Like, we cover all of that in another video. Just keep in mind, the ultimate point of worst case is it kind of starts to create this range with less certainty when you have these bigger underdogs and favorites, and it corrects for things like favorite long shot bias. And it's really about saying, when we go and play big underdogs and favorites, we're just less sure. It's a lot easier to tell when things are about a coin flip. It's a lot harder to tell if an underdog should be plus 300 or plus 400, especially when you're looking at like weird one-time events like boxing matches, or even sometimes like tennis matches or things like that, where like these are individuals that have a whole lot of uncertainty about travel schedules and health conditions and all of that. And there's so much variance in an individual's performance. Maybe they caught a flu a few days ago and nobody knows. Like, so much of that really could manage those odds differently. You just don't know. And so like, this helps control for that a little bit as well. And we'll see that when we take it to the bet detail screen in a moment. Okay. So these are the the bet sizing kind of fundamentals that you should be thinking about before you even start doing anything with the actual bets. All right, so let's go to the plays screen. So let's come over here. We're just going to use default weightings for tonight. There's not really any reason to change any of that. And let's look at, why don't we just click into this Minnesota Twins and Detroit Tigers first inning play. And this is a pretty good example of a couple things that we would want to consider. And I'm going to pretend for a moment that I wouldn't get limited to BetRivers at whatever, because my actual answer is that I'm just going to go play at BetRivers here at plus 135 for whatever they'll take, because that's the actual answer. But if we can assume, all right, we have more ability to get action down at BetRivers, this becomes a more interesting challenge. So what we see in this situation, right, we have Pinnacle, who is definitely a sharp book. One other book that doesn't have EV, and BetRivers, who also has a 1 on the weighting. Unibet is another campy book, so that's going to look exactly the same as BetRivers. And so what we see here is like, okay, well, Pinnacle leading the charge, has a nice low hold, has a favorite side of minus 129, and we're looking at BetRivers is skewed way over here, and we're like, you know what? Yeah, we dig that. And even ESPN Bet is in pretty good alignment with Pinnacle. They just have a significantly higher hold. Pretty straightforward read. So we don't need to go into too much detail on how we're reading this play in terms of identifying that BetRivers is a solid play. Okay, cool. So arbitrage is the purple, 6-point difference between Pinnacle. Like, everybody wants to play this. This one's a first 5 innings. The only downside is that it's for tomorrow. But even then, with this kind of line against Pinnacle, you're probably like, yeah, sign me up. We're going to play this. So it's a Yurfie. So yes, first inning run. So in this case, at plus 135, we could be like, all right, well, what do we want to bet? And so if you recall on the previous page, when we looked at my Kelly Criterion settings and all of that, we know that based on this 4.58%, that this recommendation of $140 seems okay. It's a little bit higher than what I've been playing recently. I might say, you know what? I'm just not quite so comfortable in betting well over $100 on something that is so kind of random as a first inning play. I might say, you know what? Let's take it down a notch and bet $100. So I could just say, okay, let's bet $100. And that in isolation, and I'm purposely ignoring this whole worst case devigging for a moment, but in isolation, be like, yeah, 4.58% calculated EV, $100, kind of taking it down from Kelly. Remember, Kelly, if you size it right with the Kelly multiplier percentage that you want to use and the bankroll settings that you have, if you do that, then what you can do when you're looking at these plays is kind of say, okay, the Kelly recommendation, and this is really what I recommend, make the Kelly recommendation the highest you want to bet under most circumstances. Now, there could be extenuating circumstances, but 98% of the time, you're not going to go above Kelly. Kelly's your maximum. And then you're just looking at ways to reduce back from there. You're just saying, okay, is there anything in this market that concerns me? Well, in this market, what you could say, well, you see BetRivers is moving in this direction, but so has Pinnacle. ESPN has moved in the other direction, but they're now just aligned to Pinnacle. So they started over by BetRivers. You'd say, this indication of line movement tells me that maybe ESPN Bet started where BetRivers is and then decided to move closer to where Pinnacle was. Maybe BetRivers is also getting called out on some line movement that Pinnacle had seen from the very beginning, and that's why they're at that point. Again, this is just a story that you start to piece together from the data that you see on the screen. And so when I look at this and I'm like, well, yeah, I feel pretty good about it. And so I might say, you know what, maybe it's 120 I want to do here. But there's another part to this story, and that is with the devigging methodology, right? Because there's a bit of a range here. Now, granted, this isn't a huge underdog by any stretch, but it's not minus 110 either. This plus 135 is a bit of an underdog. What you can see here is that it's going against, it's very small, but there's a little caret, and that stands for our logarithmic devigging methodology, which basically makes underdogs look a little worse. If we go back to what the standard was, and this is why it's really important to this conversation, all I'm going to do right now, and you don't need to know how to do this, I'm just going to show you what it looked like without our multiple devigging methodology. So in the past, it would have looked like this. This is what you would have seen before we brought in multiple devigging. And what it says here is 5% play and $160. So in isolation before, especially when I looked at all of this different line movement and everything, I'm like, I love this play. I might be betting $150, $160 even on it. Maybe $150 when I was being more aggressive. I'd be like, $150, let's go. But in reality, it's actually more likely to be 4.58 because this corrects for the long shot favorite bias. And so it makes that long shot a little bit more correct because the multiplicative does not correct for that. So you are going to tend to overplay underdogs when you use the multiplicative, as you just saw, because it was saying 5.36, right? So that's where I could have easily bet even more than what the True Kelly multiplier recommendation would have told me to play at 15%. Now, granted, it's all very conservative, so it wouldn't have been the worst thing in the world. What's the difference between 120 or 150 or 60? Probably pretty small. But if we were in like a plus 200 range, and I'll show you that, we'll find one. When that is wider, watch what happens. Because this is where the power of the devigging really comes in handy, and you're going to want to understand how it impacts your bet sizing. So all I did was turn the min-max odds off in terms of the limit to it. And here we go. This one's going to be fun. Chris Paul rebounds over 7.5. All right. So in this case, you see this huge range. If this were like Pinnacle, it'd be a better example. But what you can see is that it's a 1.98% range on DraftKings at plus 1,200. Well, if I do the same thing, now keep in mind, this is a $5 recommended bet, and it's barely plus EV at all, right? It's such a big underdog. A $5 bet is the maximum that they want me to do here. But if I did DVIG equals M on this one, let's see what happens, right? And so I can turn the DVIG range on. So now it looks like a 53% bet, and I should be betting $180. So this is why it gets kind of wacky, and why you could easily overbet your bankroll when betting higher EV plays on underdogs when you're not correcting for that favorite long shot bias. Because this plus 1,200 is probably not as good as it seems on the surface, which is what this logarithmic devigging actually solves for. So, I mean, think about that. The difference, 2% versus 53%. Think about how much that could impact your bankroll. This worst case devigging just protects you from those mistakes that you would otherwise make. But that's another good rule of thumb. And that is when you have big EV estimates, right? And it doesn't have to be a 53% estimate either. When you have, this 8% estimate could be interesting. Let's look at this. An 8% estimate, and it's actually now become an 11% because the line has moved since I had refreshed the play screen. Now you can see at ESPN Bet, this is 11% play. It's recommending a $270 play here. But what's more likely? Is it more likely that this is in fact super off, or is it that I could be misreading the market because in this particular case, we have FanDuel, BetRivers, and Sportsbet. Are we really using FanDuel, BetRivers, and Sportsbet as our sharpness? And I mean, ESPN Bet has 1 point as well, but yeah, great. It looks like an 11% play, but I'm betting $270 on this based on BetRivers and FanDuel. Are you kidding me? It's probably just as likely that FanDuel and BetRivers are off the mark and ESPN Bet's right. So this is one that you just should run away from in terms of a bet decision. Yet if you look just at aspects of the numbers, you could be betting into this with a huge amount of your bankroll just because numbers got bigger. And that's the danger. This is something that Eric and I, in developing A Train Station, we're often thinking about. And that is, how do we keep people from looking at this random play? We were using the default weightings, but we just did a little bit of monkeying on the settings here just to try to find some interesting examples. All of a sudden you could see something here and be like, oh, I just played this because it was recommended field. Please don't do that. You have to be able to see the complexity of the story. If you're going to really want to just bet blindly into stuff, at least set a decently high minimum book weighting or a decently targeted weighting system. So use like a BetOnline and Pinnacle, and then maybe you can bet a little bit more just across the board, but you really have to know what you're doing. This is why I talk about, I don't want people to just jump into A Train Station, start going willy-nilly. You will go broke. I don't care what your Kelly recommendation is. This is very powerful stuff that needs some real thought behind it and takes time, through this A Train Station University, learning this stuff so that you can know, in this case, a less sophisticated observer could be like, well, look at the line here. It's an 11%. I got to play this. And they just dropped $270 on something that was actually negative EV. That's the thing that scares me. And so we're trying to put in protections. We're trying to put in warnings. We're trying to put in minimum weighting thresholds and all of this stuff. But at the end of the day, if you want to be a sharp bettor, you got to become a sharp bettor. And if we're going to build a tool for the sharpest bettors in the world, we can't hamstring it with just training wheels. And that's something that I think some of the other tools out there have, for very good reason, done intentionally. And that they've made it simple so that it's easy to find pretty good bets. We want to find the best bets with the most sophisticated strategy, with the most precision possible. It's a different model. But if you're just getting into this, please spend some serious time learning, because these are tools not for casual. This is like providing surgical equipment to somebody and saying, well, just use it wisely. And if you're doing like backyard surgeries, it's probably not going to go well. Similar with your betting, if you're not very careful about what you're doing and knowing what you're doing, you're going to run into problems. And so that's true. Bottom line. Now, I've been talking for a little while, but the bottom line here is, when in doubt, bet less, and sometimes bet nothing. So on that continuum, if you can't see the story, if you can't realize, like, the critical thing here, it's not about the picture, it's not about the numbers, it's not about even like the whole whatever, fine, it's all fine. But when you look at this list of books and you don't immediately realize, hey, these guys aren't that good, like this isn't enough of a market to make a bet on. If you don't catch that, you could see this big 1169 and be like, oh baby, I'm doing it. You know, this is something that could really cause problems. This is actually, for those of you who remember, I lost some money for about a 4-week stretch in baseball season last year. And I think two things happened. I think one, I was misreading some of the markets because I didn't have this kind of depth of analysis, and I was way overbetting those plays. And I think very quickly I ran into a wall. And that is not a mistake I'm going to make again. And that's really the lesson behind this. Say, when in doubt, bet less. Just like a poker game. Bet less when you're just not sure if you have the best hand. Similar in bets on sports. Like, if you're like, I see a read here, I think it's good. You can dabble, value play, fine. You want to get that money in, that's cool. But don't go crazy with it. And even under the biggest circumstances, one last tip is to have a max bet that you're willing to play under any circumstances, because there's a good chance this 11.69 is not correct at all. It's not even remotely correct. So if you at least had, okay, I don't want to bet on a player prop more than $120. At least I've saved myself from the biggest mistake already, right? If I say, you know what, under best case scenario, I'm going to cap myself at 120 on that. At least then my damage is limited when I make a bad read. So that is a huge recommendation, is to say, give yourself a dollar hard limit on the top, no matter what the EV is. You'll thank yourself later. One of the other techniques I do is with Caesars. Caesars is a book that I have not consistently beat, as opposed to books like FanDuel and DraftKings, who I have consistently beat. Caesars, I've had a lot rockier of a relationship. There's been times where I've beat them handily, and then there's been times where I've kind of lost my way and not won as much, or lost. So I give myself like an $80 hard cap at Caesars until I can be convinced that my reading of Caesars is consistent enough that I am beating them in the long term. And that, I think, is very responsible, right? Because we're not here to be right. We're here to make money betting, right? So if you're not sure, if you can't quantify it, you can't find the data, don't give up and just stop betting. You'll never learn anything that way. But do think about how you can use betting as part of your strategy, their bet sizing as part of your strategy, so that you can gain more information in the most responsible manner possible. So with that, those are really the key things that I wanted to cover in the context of bet sizing for this. Now, if we have any questions from the folks in our A-Train Station members Discord, now would be a good time to ask them, and we can talk through some of those questions, and I can, either bring up examples or just voice over it as you would like. So the question is depending on the number of bets you get in per day, or can get in per day, should you be raising or lowering your Kelly multiplier, your bet sizing, so that you can get more of your bankroll in play? I would say if you were getting enough bets that you could exhaust your entire bankroll at low bet sizes, that's obviously not a problem when it comes to like the Kelly Criterion or bet sizing or whatever. That's great. If you're getting 200 bets a day, Yeah, bet whatever it takes to get your entire bankroll in motion, because this whole day breakdown thing is very arbitrary. It's not really an important metric in the long run. Like, each play has a positive EV expectation. You want to play as many of them as possible. However, if you are betting fewer bets in a day and you still want to get as much of your bankroll on a percentage basis in as you can, you are going to have some serious risk if you artificially overbet that bankroll. You're basically then running into the problem of potential risk of ruin, because if you only have 20 bets on a day, you can lose 20 bets in a day. And if that's your entire bankroll, sorry, game over. Right. And so that's the thing that I would worry about, is overbetting individual plays. Because of that variance, normal variance is going to have an outsized impact on you because you're betting a larger percentage of your portfolio on any given play. And so that's what I would highly caution you against. I would rather see you, no matter how many bets you had in a day, just bet similarly. That's kind of what I do, is like the size of my bankroll is kind of irrelevant because my comfort in betting is so much lower than what my bankroll can actually support. So it's not an issue. I just know I'm not getting nearly enough of my bankroll in if my goal was to just maximize my returns and run at some amount of risk of serious losses. Probably not going broke, but serious losses could occur. And in the past for me have, in short order, because I was pushing that bankroll to its maximum. And that's a strategic decision you have to decide. What are your investment objectives in sports betting, right? That's the thing that you have to ask yourself. Like, what are you trying to do here? If you say, okay, I have a $5,000 bankroll and my goal is to triple it as quickly as possible, that's one goal. But you have to say to yourself, well, if I overplay this and things go cold on me, which they will from time to time, even with the best analytics and metrics and strategy in the world, you're going to have cold runs. And when that happens, what are the potential consequences? And so can you handle the swings that are associated with that level of bet sizing, realizing that when you have fewer bets with bigger amounts, your variance is going to go much higher. And that's just the nature of the way the numbers work. Hopefully this has been useful. I want to thank you for watching this. Hopefully, regardless of whether you're an 8 Train Station member or whether this is something that you're considering, at least now you can understand how sports betting sizing, the size of the bets that you're making, can have this Kelly Criterion basis to them. But that's only one of several different factors that you're going to want to consider. And some things are actually much more important than simply trying to maximize the growth of your bankroll, maximizing the overall growth. We love to do that, but sometimes you realize that maybe those peaks and valleys are just not worth, the indigestion you might have in pursuit of trying to raise that bankroll as fast as possible. So just manage it and think about other scenarios where you're managing risk, managing a portfolio, and that will guide you well. But at the end of the day, if you find that your bet sizing is such that you're not having fun doing this, or that it's causing you physical anguish, which I've been there, when you have those down days, bet less. I mean, that's a simple answer. When in doubt, bet less. And that's probably the biggest rule in bet sizing that you should remember. All the other details kind of serve to the same purpose. So with that, everyone, thank you for joining me. For now, this train's leaving the station. Until next time, save the units for the bros and do your betting like the pros.